countries, the Gulf countries. And so what the world is coming to learn, or what the society or the community is waking up to, is that things are not always rosy. The grass is not always greener on the other side, right? And so therefore there is questions as to what is it that we can do as citizens of this country, but is that all when you talk about human trafficking? Is it only happening abroad? Is it only happening within the GCC countries? Is it happening here in Kenya? And I'm hoping that in the next 40 or so minutes, this is something that we can be able to share. So good. I think I can be able to share my screen.
Yes, you can.
All right, so I think we'll just, I'll jump right in and just carry on. Thank you so much, Modani, for this opportunity. I think let's just get into it. So what is human trafficking? When we talk about trafficking, I want us to reflect on a few things here. One is that human trafficking, first, one crime. It's not one crime. It's not one event. It is a series of events that lead to a bigger crime. It's also a collection of crimes, right? So that what we are seeing on the media today concerning people being trafficked for purposes of labor is just one form of trafficking. And it starts with, and I'll go into the nuances, but we'll start with, the recruitment process. It will go to the fine, the amount of money that people have to pay to make, so that they can travel abroad. It will also do with what it is, the promises that people are being given. So it also includes sexual abuse in the process. It includes, so there are many, it's a collection of crimes, and it is a criminal process rather than an event. Another one of the shocking information that I find on the internet is that human trafficking in Africa is a 13.1 billion industry, and out of this, 8.9 billion comes from sexual exploitation. So victims of sex trafficking yield up to $21,000, 800 each, due to high demand. So even while forced labor has 3 times more victims, which is what forced labor is, what we are seeing on the news and everything, sexual exploitation generates more than double the profits. So already, I think one of the things that is coming out from this conversation is that there is a lot of money involved, and there's a lot of benefit that comes with it. So just 1 second, let me hide my this is a bit further back. So the Anti-Human Trafficking Child Protection Unit, which is one of the institutions that we have here in Kenya, flags that there was a spike on online human trafficking. This was during the COVID period. At the same year, and this has there's more information on it, the recent information. In 2020, in Kenya, the Kenyan officers here, they intercept Ugandan female victims of trafficking. 41 minors as young as 14, between 14 and 18, at the JKIA. Where were they going? To the Gulf countries. Also, there are these estimates that because of the COVID and because of the inflation and everything that the world is going through, their chances are that issues to do with child labor will actually increase. There's going to be a 0.7% increase in child labor in certain countries. Now, unfortunately, all these are setbacks to what the progress that countries had made when it came to tackling issues to do with human trafficking, specifically on child labor and specifically on forced labor. So I'm hoping that from this these reflections that already we can see where human trafficking lies. What are some of those push and pull factors? And we're going to learn a bit more on that. But we can also start asking ourselves, where did the rain start beating us? What is it that we can do to address some of these issues? Like child labor. Should children really be working or in school? Why is it that the Ugandan girls, for instance, victims are traveling through Kenya? Why is it that there's online human trafficking in this country? What is it that is making our children susceptible to it? There is a recent study that was also done by the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, and they also came up with very jarring statistics about human trafficking, especially actually forced labor for Kenyan labor migrants to the Gulf countries. And they talk about how this, and this is something we will share with Modoni, they talk about how the girls are recruited and the women are recruited from Kenya, and that they're taken to the Gulf countries, and how slowly what was a very hopeful situation where they were looking for greener pastures becomes their worst nightmare, and how just looking for a job, how lack of employment pushed people to becoming trafficked. So what is trafficking? We we find the trafficking definition within one of the international policies called the UN Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. And sometimes people ask, why is it especially women and children? It's because this law borrows its identity from many years back, when trafficking was mostly about sexual exploitation for women and for girls. And that is why, with time, when the law came to be developed, the treaty itself, then they said, if we leave out women and girls, chances are women and children, they will be forgotten. The main aim of this law will be forgotten. And so they said, in as much as it might look biased, this is a decision that was made by countries who are sitting around a table and coming up with the UN National Protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking. They said, if we forget to include women and children, then we will forget this core, who are the most susceptible to trafficking. So trafficking in persons includes three things. There is a recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons. That is one aim, one part of it. And how are these people, how are they recruited, how are they transported? It is through means of force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power, etc. And for purposes of exploitation. This is what makes trafficking. That this process that the person has to endure, whether it's a child or an adult, it is for purposes of exploitation. And exploitation includes many things, from sexual exploitation, forced labor, child labor, radicalization, removal of organs, slavery, and practices similar to slavery. And the drafters of this law will tell you that you cannot maximize, you can't put a limit to what that purpose of exploitation is. And so for anyone to remember, we normally say that trafficking is action, means, and purpose. So how are the persons, what were the actions that were included? Recruitment, transportation, harboring. What were the means that were used? Deceit, threat, use of force. And what was the purpose? So long as we can show that there is a purpose of exploitation, there's that exploitative element. And the exploitation can be by anybody, by the trafficker, it can be by the person who is receiving the victim, it can be by the process itself. So the exploitation happens. Remember that human trafficking is that series of crimes, and so exploitation can happen at any given point. Something else that is interesting to remember is that in itself, the exploitation in and itself, it's actually a crime. So sexual exploitation is a crime, child labor is a crime, removal of organs is a crime, servitude is a crime, forced labor is a crime. All of them are criminal actions within the Kenyan law. And so therefore, the notion that we always hear that, we couldn't arrest a person and charge them with trafficking because we didn't know or we weren't sure. If you find a trafficker and you know that this person harbors victims for purposes of trafficking, even without knowing that they're transporting or recruiting, or so long as you know that there's somebody who does that, and you know that they do not have the requisite say licenses to run, say for instance, a shelter, to run a recruitment agency, that is a person who's already committing a crime, right? And so we might not say it has all the three elements of trafficking, but it has one of those elements which is already a criminal offense. So remember this, I hope helps us to understand that trafficking is then the series of crimes and the collection of crimes. Now, on the other hand, child trafficking is this, what we have said, actions and exploitation, but we do not need to show the means, because children in Kenya especially have no capacity to consent. But this means right here says that the person, either the person's ability to consent is taken away because of use of deceitful means, force, threat, and all these things. So because children do not consent, therefore when it comes to going to court, we do not need to show the element of means. We just need to show that the child was either recruited, whatever, for purposes of exploitation. It doesn't matter that they were cheated. It doesn't matter that somebody tricked them, because children cannot consent. Now, what are you heard me talking about the push and pull factors. And when you hear people on the TV talking, ulienda kutafuta nini? What were you looking for? Why is it that you decided to run away from home? It's because of these things we call push and pull. So push factors are mostly what? Negative. They're the ones that cause vulnerability to persons, and therefore they need to find greener pastures. The pull factor is what is bringing is the greener pastures that you're seeing on the other side of the fence. And so those ones are many. We can talk about them. We talked about poverty. We talked about ignorance. We talk about, lack of understanding of the law. We can talk about, various issues. For instance, war, conflict. So these are some of those push factors. Now, the pull factors, those that entice and encourage persons. So like jobs, education, But there's something else that is very interesting. There's a very interesting concept when it comes to trafficking as well. So it's not just about, I'll be looking at the comments as we go on, and Mudhani can help me with that. There's an interesting thing about trafficking and what fuels human trafficking is that there is this high reward, low risk. Remember the fact that the numbers, the amounts of monies that you were talking about. So there is the idea of there's a high reward, there's low risk, because then the high reward allows for traffickers and perpetrators of human trafficking to pay their way, as they go, because it's a continuum, it's that journey, and they can pay their way. So that means that they can reduce the risk. The second thing that fuels human trafficking is this idea of supply and demand. You always hear that there's high demand for people to work in factories. There is a high demand for shoes. There's a high demand for vehicles. There's a high demand for coffee in a certain country. So what do? We hire children, or we hire young people or vulnerable people, because we need a lot of people to come and harvest and work within our farms so that we can be able to meet the high demand for whatever product. So it can be clothes, it can be food, it can be, commodities, whatever it is. But it can also be sex. A high demand for commercial sex. Also, and therefore you need a lot of people to actually meet that demand. The third thing that fuels human trafficking is systematic inequalities. So some of the facts we're giving here, this is borrowed from UNICEF, is 47% of people living in extreme poverty are 18 years old or under. So one of the first inequalities is this idea of poverty. And poverty is as one of the president of International Justice Mission said, that poverty is the greatest injustice, because it means that you have no access to any arm of justice. And also the idea of, say, inequalities to do with gender roles, so that only women can access certain jobs and men can access certain jobs, meaning that women will always be vulnerable. Children as well are vulnerable because of their age. Then there is systematic inequalities in terms of even the governance structures, even where we are situated. So for instance, I'm so happy we're joined by somebody from Kakuma. Well, I visited Kakuma just the other day, and I was shocked by what I found on the ground. And I said, I don't understand then. I mean, then I said to myself, I imagine that justice then must be a very far concept. Because if the people, the host community in Kakuma, or community in Kakuma have constant access to, food, to water, to education, what is justice to them? Do they, at what point do you walk up to the police and say, I am suffering an injustice, yet you do not even have food in your house? So this kind of systematic inequalities also really fuel human trafficking for vulnerable. I'm going to skip through this because we already talked about it. So in Kenya, then therefore human trafficking, we had already read some of the statistics, so I'm going to stop. But Kenya is what is known as a source, a destination, and a transit point. We are a source country because Kenyans are trafficked to the Gulf countries and other African nations. They also traffic to Europe, to North America for domestic servitude, unfortunately for sale of organs and work in brothels. Kenya is also a destination country where we have nationalities from other countries: Burundi, Ethiopia. What has happened? Burundi, Ethiopia, Rwanda, DRC, Somalia, Tanzania, Uganda. And they are trafficked to various Kenyan towns, including Kisumu, Nakuru, Nairobi, Mombasa, for domestic and farm work, commercial sexual exploitation, etc., etc. Kenya is also, and I think, so it's also a destination country for people from India and from Nepal. These are new numbers that we started getting, I think, around 2020, when we rescued quite a number of people here in Kenya from these particular countries. And I think you've seen them on the news. They come here to dance in the mudras and, all this. So Kenya is also a transit point for all these other nationalities. And that is why you're finding the Ugandan girls, for instance, being rescued at the airport while they are on their way to the Gulf countries. So what is the legal framework that we have in Kenya that deals with human trafficking? I will mention some. So there is the Counter Trafficking in Persons Act. That is the law that covers human trafficking. There is the Sexual Offences Act that covers aspects. You remember we talked about that, human trafficking is a series of crimes. So the Sexual Offences Act talks about some of those aspects. Then there is the Penal Code. Then we have the Witness Protection Act, which talks about protection of victims. There's the Employment Act, because the Employment Act is what creates the framework for what work is and what work should be for children, when it comes to children, when it comes to adults, and what are the protection mechanisms. So anything outside that Employment Act then becomes a question of forced labor. Then we have the Victim Protection Act, which provides for protection of victims and restitution. And then we have the Kenya Citizenship and Immigration Act. And we have the Children Act as well, the Children Act 2022, which also defines what human trafficking is. So a little bit of a deep dive in trafficking. And Modani, please alert me when it's time.
No, you still have time.
All right, good. Okay. All right. So then we have so let me just spend a bit more time here. The Counter Trafficking in Persons Act. Now, Section 3 of the Counter Trafficking in Persons Act talks about what trafficking then is. So it defines what human trafficking is, being what we said earlier: the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons or a child for purposes of exploitation. Then there is a territorial scope. Yeah. So then trafficking is as an act of trafficking in persons may be committed internally within the borders of the country or internationally across the border of Kenya. So what is important to remember from this is that trafficking does not only happen with internationally. So we don't have to wait for somebody to travel to say, oh, by the way, they were trafficked. We don't have to wait for them to cross the border to say they were trafficked. Trafficking happens both internally, and in Kenya it's both internal and then there is international. So long as there is that movement of persons for purposes of exploitation, that amounts to trafficking. The fines are very hefty. You have 30 million. If somebody is charged with human trafficking, you have 30 million fine, or 30 years, or both, or upon subsequent conviction to a life imprisonment. Then what is important again, and I like insisting on this, is that exploitation we cannot limit. But in our act, we then define all this: involuntary servitude, forcible and fraudulent use of human beings, for removal of body parts, for being taken into armed conflict, child labor, sexual exploitation, child marriage, forced marriage. We define, in the Counter Trafficking in Persons Act, defines the exploitation purposes as far as they can go. So we are talking that in our law acknowledges that human trafficking can happen within the country or internationally across the border, and Kenya recognizes that is trafficking. Child trafficking is defined within the Counter Trafficking in Persons Act, as I said, and it's also defined within the Children Act. And it is the same thing. What we don't have for us lawyers when we go to court, and the prosecutors, they do not have to prove the means through which the child was trafficked. The only important information they need is to say the child was recruited, transported, transferred, or harbored, or received for purposes of exploitation. Exploitation, which is either sexual exploitation, forced labor, child marriage, any of those, radicalization, recruitment into armed conflict, etc., etc. But the law also is cognizant of the fact that a child may be trafficked through other means. Yeah, and one of those means under Section 4 of the Act is that is what we call acts that promote human trafficking or child trafficking, which include adoption, fostering, offering a child up for guardianship for purposes of trafficking. In Kenya, we're also seeing quite a lot of this now, which is interesting, that people are using a way to foster children, especially, and guardianship orders to traffic children. So the law is very cognizant of that, and is saying, look, if any of these means are used to traffic children, then it is a criminal offense under the Counter Trafficking in Persons Act. Some other provisions within the Act, and I'm just going to fly through these ones very quickly, is Section 4, which criminalizes the act, I say that, there of adoption, and it attracts a fine of 20 million or 30 years imprisonment. Then there is the act of leasing, occupying, permitting the occupation of a premises, publishing, exportation, and importation of materials for purposes of promoting trafficking in persons. So this is what I was saying, that sometimes, even as citizens or as a police, we are waiting to hear, to round up 30 people in a house, right, to say that these ones have been trafficked. But the Counter Trafficking in Persons Act, which was very forward-looking, it's a 2010 law but gazetted in 2012. It was very forward-looking in terms of what else could encompass trafficking. And this act of leasing out, occupying, permitting occupation of a premises for purposes of promoting trafficking in itself is a crime. So what am I looking out for as a practitioner of the law, or a prosecutor, or a police, is to look out for licenses. Why are you operating? What is your MO? Why are you in operations? The other aspect or offense that is covered within the Counter Trafficking Persons Act is fraudulent acquisition of travel documents for purposes of trafficking of persons or assisting in the same, which attracts 10 million or 10 years imprisonment, or both. Again, so this is helping people acquire travel documents. So I don't know if this triggers the I want to call them fake recruitment agencies, or the briefcase recruitment agencies that are operating in a clandestine manner, and they are helping people acquire documentation for purposes of traveling, but in essence, they're going to be exploited. Then there is this other offenses, the act of aiding or abetting in exiting or entry of persons into the country for purposes of trafficking in persons. So this one obviously is targeting so much. So if you think about it, the people who are at the border points or at the hotspot areas. So for us, for one of the organizations that I work with, the Love Justice International Kenya, we are situated within the what we call, hotspots. So at the bus station, for instance, at border points as well, so that we can ask ourselves, before somebody crosses, we ask the persons who are actually traveling, and we ask them, where are you going? Who helped you get your documentation? Have you been to this country before? Or have you been to this city before? So this section 7, if you look at it, is also really targeting even our immigration officers. Because sometimes, you find cases where people are looking away and their reports, I think one of the trafficking in persons reports showed that, there's these nuances of persons accepting, bribes or whatever to allow people to come into the country, even though, we don't know for sure if they're in safe hands. Because that's the argument. I have been stopped severally on border points by the police or the customs or immigration officers, and I'm always asking them, how come you're not asking? How come you don't want to find out if I am rightfully here and I am safe where I am? You're not asking the right questions so that you can know that I'm not a victim of trafficking. And their answer is always, how will I know? How will I know? What are the questions I should ask? Then there is obviously the interference, section 8, the interference of documents and personal effects of another in furtherance of trafficking in persons, attracting another 10 years or 10 million fine. And there is causing victims of trafficking permanent or life-threatening bodily harm, death, or terminal ailment, attracts life imprisonment. I want to make just a comment here. So causing victims of trafficking permanent or life-threatening harm. When we started, Modoni pointed out to us this case of this lady who came back and could not use her arms, were not functioning because of the exploitation that they underwent when they were employed. So who is to be held accountable? And I'm happy that Veronica is joining us on this call, because then she will, highlight some of these things to us. But truly, the persons who were involved in the process of the recruitment of this young girl should be held and should be found culpable, as you can very well see within our counter-trafficking in persons. So the counter-trafficking in persons, what it has done is that to address all these issues of trafficking, it has provided us with institutions. And one of the institutions, which was mentioned also in my bio, is the Advisory Committee, the Advisory Committee on Counter-Trafficking in Persons Act. It is established within Section 19. And this body was established to implement or to support the government in the implementation of the law. And it has various membership, as you can see in my presentation, from immigration officers, foreign affairs, gender, children, labor, the ODPP, Department of Justice, the Attorney General, Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, specifically there, civil society representatives, COTU, Federation of Kenya Employers, and a secretariat, which is hosted by the Department or the Directorate of Children's Services, as it is called now. And I hope somebody from the secretariat is also joining us. Its functions, as I said, can be classified in various ways. So there is formulation of policies. And then there is coordination of activities. There is monitoring and evaluation, evaluating the progress of Kenya's efforts on prevention, protection, and prosecution of human trafficking in Kenya. Let me just go back there a little bit. So one of the key things that the advisory committee did, and Veronica and I sat in the first advisory committee, and she now chairs the current advisory committee. And one of the important things that first advisory committee did was to identify where there was a gap in terms of our steps as a country to address the issue of human trafficking. And for that, we created what we call the National Plan of Action, which talked about three-pronged strategy to deal with human trafficking. That is prevention, protection, and prosecution. And also developed another document called the National Referral Mechanism, which is a policy document, a guide document rather, that shows the pathway of trafficking, but also directs the various agencies. When you find a case of trafficking, how do you deal with it? Who do you report? Where do you record it? Especially for the government institutions. How do you record it? How do you escalate this case from one office to the other? Because one of the things you'll realize is that human trafficking is, no one likes, the traffickers don't want us to shed light in the idea on human trafficking. They want it to be kept hush. So it's a network of persons who do this. So they are very organized, but they do not want you to shed light. So the National Referral Mechanism allows us to see the pathway for how to deal with victims of trafficking, so that we are talking about rehabilitation. We are talking about helping them. We are talking about ensuring that persons are not re-trafficked. The other institution that was established within the Counter-Trafficking Persons Act is the Trust Fund for Victims of Trafficking. Because trafficking, remember those things that fuel trafficking? Is to ensure that the fund was established to ensure that these victims do not become re-victimized, and they do not become re-trafficked. And so the Counter-Trafficking in Persons Act established a board of trustees that then will assist the victims of trafficking through the trust fund. And so it has the money, and it has the functions of the board, which really is to deal with ensuring that these monies go to the right people. So, having said that, where do the solutions lie? Remember, because trafficking is about this idea of push factors, there are three obligations that are established within the international legal framework we talked about, which is the UN Convention, the Protocol on Human Trafficking, preventing and suppressing human trafficking. It establishes three obligations of the state. One is to criminalize, investigate, and punish trafficking in persons. And in Kenya, we have the counter-trafficking. We have actually within DCI there are two units. There is Transnational Organized Crime Unit that deals with all transnational organized crimes, including human trafficking, and then there is the Anti-Human Trafficking and Child Protection Unit, which specifically draws attention to issues on child trafficking and child abuse. So those are the ones who are bestowed with that responsibility to criminalize, to investigate, and punish, right? And then of course we have the courts, the judiciary, and we have the prosecutors. Then number two, there is the obligation of the state parties towards victim protection and support. Now, one of the very key things that this law did, the Counter-Trafficking Persons Act, if it is implemented, and I'm happy that we have this forum today, because all of us should implement and work towards its implementation, is one of the most important part is Section 15, which talks about victim protection and support, including legal support, including psychosocial support, including restitution. It is something that is not, highly talked about. And the third solution lies in preventing trafficking by addressing factors that include vulnerability of persons and bilateral and multilateral cooperation. So we have said over and over again that, especially with labor migration to the GCC countries, the issue is unfair recruitment practices. So why aren't we addressing those in this country? Why are we quick to say that our girls are not agile enough to survive in some of the GCC countries? Why not equip them? Our government signs bilateral agreements. This is a form of preventing trafficking. We signed this multilateral cooperation, so we've signed bilateral agreements with the GCC countries. And this is information you can find at the Ministry of Labor's website. That talk about, and this in the bilateral labor agreements, you find, how much people should be paid and what are the terms of conditions and what is expected of the receiving state and what is expected of the sending state, being Kenya. So why is it that we are not hard on fair recruitment practices, so that when we are talking on a round table, we're not just saying that, you see, these girls are looking for jobs on a jipeleka. I've heard people talk about it, they're trafficking themselves, which is it's a lie. There's nothing like that. So when you talk about fair recruitment practices, what is it that we can do to enable the Kenyan citizenship, whenever they're looking for employment, that they should be able to be protected, whether it is skilled or unskilled? And this is a prevention aspect. Why not create employment here, or create employment within Africa, so that then we are not having our citizenship really change? Maybe if it's culture, that is one of the issues. So there is a huge obligation here that the state has to look at and see what to do. One final solution is what I do with Love Justice International. And our work is to fight against trafficking and to intercept persons before the exploitation actually takes place. And so we look at, we have, if you see this right here, this is a red flag. And we have a form called the Intercept Record Form. And you will meet our monitors on the street and they will stop you. And they will ask you a bunch of questions, and what they'll be looking for are the red flags. And if the red flags are more than the green flags, that is reason enough to ask you, do you want to reconsider your journey? Do you want to reconsider, whether it is here in the bus station where we are located, whether it is in Mombasa, whether it is at the border point where we did some work in Busia? We are going to ask you, do you want to rethink your journey? And if somebody is following you, and in the case that it is a trafficker, we engage and involve the police so that they can come and do the arrest, and hopefully we are able to rescue the person before the exploitation takes place, and we are able to repatriate the person back home with a bit more information on what trafficking is and why they should not fall prey to trafficking. So in short, this is what we do. We stand in the most strategic places to intervene. And so we essentially, here is where we say, while you are on transit, while a person is on transit, there is necessary information that they need that may make them reconsider what it is that the steps that they're going to take. And after we rescue you, we help you to take you back home. And as I said, with a bit more information, and we work in Nairobi, in Mombasa, and we're starting a project in Busia. And we've been able to see quite some successes in our work, and rescued quite a number of persons since we started our work here in Kenya. Thank you very much. I will yield the floor to Veronica if she's joined us. And back to you, Modani.
Thank you so much, Juliet. You've really given us a wealth of information when it comes to human trafficking. So before we go to the Q&A session, because I can see the questions on the chat section, I want to introduce Veronica, because Veronica, as you can rightly see, when Juliet makes a reference to the advisory committee, and I think this is why you sit also now as a chairperson, would want to get your view. If you look closely through the session, the questions are, what is the government doing? What is it doing? Why can't we provide services? But I want to take in summation of everything that Juliet has said. Human trafficking is an all of us problem. It's not just the animal that is called the government. It's for every one of us that if you identify areas that you can say something is about responsibility as a Kenyan. So Veronica is the Deputy Director, Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, also an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. a human rights advocate who is currently the chairperson of the National Advisory Committee in Counter-Trafficking in Persons, and a deputy director at the Kenya National Commission of Human Rights. Her previous experience has cut across through law firms, child rights, protection advocacy work in non-governmental organizations, investigation advocacy work at Kenya National Human Rights, and of course, has also worked in training and public policy consultant with the UN and other regional organizations. So a very warm welcome to you, Veronica. If you would kindly chime in terms of the advisory committee and of course in its work, we'll be very happy to hear all about that. Thank you and karibu.
Thank you so much and good morning.
Good morning.
Veronica Mwangi is my name. So allow me to just delve into the discussions, and I'm happy that Juliet has been able to set a proper foundation on exactly what is human trafficking and how does it impact on Kenyans community, but also beyond that, what is the role of the different actors, and majority of us are today in this particular meeting. So allow me to speak about the Counter-Trafficking in Persons Secretariat, which is a secretariat that has been formed by virtue of the Counter-Trafficking in Persons Act in order to support the work of advisory committee. One of the key things I would really want to speak to is the fact that the advisory committee, which was chaired earlier by Madam Juliet, who was speaking to us, is an establishment of the statute law, that is the Counter-Trafficking Persons Act, that actually provides a framework where different actors who are drawn as members from the state and non-state actors are able to deliberate more on different efforts to combat trafficking in persons. And one of the key things I would want to speak is the fact that some of the steps that have been taken by the advisory committee are manifest with regard to number of cases that are now being reported about trafficking in persons, number of different programs or actors, be it government or non-governmental organizations that have really come about and are able to, they have started implementing different programs to prevent and protect, trafficking in persons, but again, to protect the victims of trafficking by offering various services. So one of the areas that I think as Kenyans, we are really making headways is the area of awareness creation. Of course, we are really not yet there because again, trafficking in person is an area where even the law enforcement authorities, starting with the police, even the judicial officers, of course, we the professionals as advocates and different agencies of government are still not quite aware of what trafficking is all about. However, there has been a bit of progress in understanding what we are speaking about when we speak about cases of trafficking, how we are able to tap in and at least get to understand where either our girls who probably go abroad or even who are still working in here within Kenya are trafficked in one way or the other. So the advisory committee does not work alone. The advisory committee largely is a membership of different institutions, and their work is to advise the cabinet secretary responsible for matters counter-trafficking on how to coordinate efforts towards combating trafficking in persons, but at the same time to advise the CS on different reforms that are needed. And as such, there was need then to have a secretariat, and the secretariat is now sort of the technical and the implementing section of the work of the advisory committee. And with the secretariat, we have Mary Mbuga with us here. The secretariat work entails a lot of implementing what the advisory committee has advised and the different ways they have been working. Starts with one collecting cases or receiving cases of victims of trafficking or cases of migrants who are in distress, because by virtue of that, they are able then to do the screening, what we call the different interviews, and they're able then to identify whether we have presumed victims of trafficking or actual victims of trafficking, having looked at the facts that are provided, but again, being guided by the elements that Madam Juliet has spoken about, the act, the means, and the purpose, which is the exploitation. The other way the Secretariat supports is that they offer rescue services, but also investigations jointly with the DCI. There are two different units within the DCI that are very keen on investigating matters trafficking in persons. And beyond that also, they are very keen on awareness creation, the actual implementation, but at the same time, the actual support that is then needed when we narrow down and identify a victim of trafficking who probably needs shelter or even psychosocial support or even legal redress and any other service. We have, through the Counter Trafficking in Persons Act, what we speak to what is called National Assistance Trust Fund. This is a fund also that was created by the Act, and the fund has what we call Board of Trustees who manages this fund. The fund so far, there has been a development of guidelines that are now going to ensure that at least the victims of trafficking are not just rescued, but rather they are supported, they are integrated. And in doing so, sorry, the government of Kenya will be able then to collect more information to identify gaps that has been existing and of course bring solutions once and for all and ensure that at least the Kenyans in diaspora do not really suffer trafficking or even the violations that have been mentioned by Madam Juliet, but also ensure that also internally we put our house in order, because human trafficking does not necessarily occur when it comes to international trafficking. Internally, again, we still have cases that are rampant on trafficking of persons, and in particular children and women. So I would want to just indicate that currently we are reviewing the Counter Trafficking in Persons Act. The Act is still being looked at by different stakeholders. So any input from practitioners here would really be very helpful in terms of just harnessing and ensuring that all the gaps are closed. And finally, allow me to just mention that we have what we call the National Referral Mechanism. This is a guideline that was developed 2018, and Juliet has alluded to it, a guideline that is used by different actors, ensuring that at least we are able to map out and identify victims of trafficking properly, but at the same time support them when it comes to getting them the relevant assistance. And with that, I think because of time, allow me to stop at that and maybe we can go into the plenary. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Veronica. I don't know, Juliet, I think we might be short of time in terms of having a complete panel session. So allow me to just dive deep into the questions that I can see on the chat session. So the first question is from Miss Seagate. When a government licenses a recruitment agency, how do they ensure that the said agency actually does what they were licensed to do? What is the sort of the enforcement mechanism of their mandate?
Veronica, do you want to tackle this, or do you want me to handle it? Because this is the functions of the other agency, which we didn't quite highlight, which is the National Employment Agency, NEA. And NEA is the one that has the responsibility to register the recruitment agencies and then follow up and ensure that the recruitment agencies are, responsible. So indeed, the recruitment agency will go to NEA and they will register. And the questions I have always had, I've always asked, and maybe Veronica and Ms. Mbuga could also help with this, is what is the monitoring mechanism like? And do they have the capacity, for instance, to be able to handle this, the number of recruitment agencies? Because when we started the recruitment, the licensing, actually new licensing of recruitment agencies, the numbers shot up from about 32 to 200, 300. I wish I had my with me, but there are quite a number now in terms of the recruitment agencies. And so sometimes I have the question that, because there are mechanisms. They're supposed to do the monitoring, they're supposed to do the ensure that the recruitment agencies are following the processes. But I think a bigger question I have for the government, which Veronica is representing, and other, is maybe do they have any?
Thank you, Juliet. Allow me to also add into that. We now have the National Employment Authority, and I know the question about oversight has been raised again and again. And this is an area where there's a lot of discussion that is ongoing currently, both in Parliament, but also outside when it comes to the different ministries and agencies. For instance, at the National Commission, we are really keen on ensuring at least issues of migrants' rights, and especially the rights of our Kenyans, are not abused. So the issue of oversight is an area that we are coming in, but currently we have a national technical committee that was launched a year ago, and this was a forum or an initiative led by the previous CS, Chelugui. And with this particular technical committee that was established, it has different membership, both from the Ministry of Labor, Ministry of Labor, the different ministries, Foreign Affairs, Interior, and of course, the different representatives from the recruitment agencies and communities, all aimed at ensuring that they start discussing matters on how to strengthen oversight. But currently, what is going on is that NEA, by virtue of them vetting the different recruitment agencies, they have to keep tab. And every time they receive a case, and they have online contact, every time they receive a case of a Kenyan in distress, whether be it in the Gulf or any other country, they are able to work closely with the recruitment agencies and ensure that at least they trace and get this person back into the country. The only gap we still have is the gap of follow-up on redress, and of course, the gap of getting adequate information to influence our policies. But as you speak again, we have a draft labor migration policy that is pending, but also we have a draft national migration policy that is pending, and hopefully, if once we have these particular documents are enacted, we'll have proper framework that is well grounded in law. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica. That was quite concise, and thank you, Juliet, for your contribution as well. So we have a question from Margaret Kemuma. I think this is Margaret from Kakuma. What is the role of the Kenyan embassies in such countries? To what extent can they intervene in cases of trafficking? I think you've almost mentioned something akin to that, Veronica, where you have this technical committee that also sits the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I do hope that, Margaret, that answers your question. And unless you have a comment, Juliet or Veronica, on the same.
Yeah, there's also the labor attaches. So in this, especially within the Gulf countries, one of the things that we did, the Kenya did, and again, the Cabinet Secretary, former for Labor, Ministry of Labor, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as well, is through the bilateral labor agreements, and also coming up with labor attaches, so that those cases, when there is a case of trafficking, it can be reported to the labor attaché. And I see the next question, actually, somebody asks about the shelter. So if there's a case that is reported in one of the Gulf countries, then that case can be reported, then the labor attaché can work with the community, rescue the person, put them within the shelter as they prepare to repatriate them back into the country. And that was the rationale. I see the next, sorry to jump, but I see somebody saying, why in Saudi or other countries, the cabinet secretary costs, which is a lot of money. What is the rationale? No, not really. I still get some of these cases. What would happen is once the migrant would run away from or the employee would run away from the employer, they would go and sit together and huddle up in a house, one that is created by the community that is already there. Unfortunately, they would be arrested and charged even with prostitution. And so therefore, that was not really a means for them to be safe. And that is why the government thought one of the things that we can do for our labor migrants within the GCC countries is come up with this shelter so that the people can stay there within the safety mechanisms and protection mechanisms that have been established within the law. And then as they await to be repatriated back here in Kenya, and that is why there was need for it.
Thank you, Juliet. I think that you have almost tackled two questions with regards to the role that government is playing and the safe houses. So I think there's a question from Emily Kimani. Maybe she can unmute and give more context, but her question is, does the Board of Trustees execute this mandate? Several people have been stuck abroad while unwell and only arrive back as corpses. Is this information well circulated? Any civic education on how they can access and the requirements? I think, Veronica, you had touched a bit of, there's a lot of awareness that is actually ongoing. I think here is a question of how does it completely percolate downwards, or how is this done to actually get to, Wanjiko to get this information? Maybe you can speak on that.
Thank you. So just speaking about the Board of Trustees, number one, the greater challenge that we have is the finances. Again, all of us are very clear that the government is not really funding some of these particular infrastructures. Reasons being, again, COVID-19, but of course, economic and so on and so forth. So one, we have the trust fund, we have the Board of Trustees. Initially, the Board of Trustees was not able to support even to support most of the Kenyan or victims of trafficking, because number one, there was concerns about the funding. They had only 20 million to address some of these cases. But also beyond that, there were requirements that were needed to operationalize the trust fund, and the registration, the opening of the account, of course, the treasury regulations and so on. But so far, so good. I would want to just indicate that at least the processes have opened up. All the operationalization of the fund has started, and the fund has so far supported more than 20 cases. And recently, that is, as we speak, recently, we were able to develop guidelines that will not just allow the board to wait for one case that is reported, but rather will empower the board to work with the different organizations that offer services to the victims of trafficking, so that then we are able at least to ensure that we are not running around when we have one case that has been reported as if it's a rapid response, but rather the different victims of trafficking will have the services awaiting in readiness when need occurs, but at the same time also we'll be focusing so much on prevention mechanisms. So that's what I would want to say about the board. About awareness, there is so much that the Secretariat is doing, and the social protection website. The social protection website, we have the CTIP section there, but also visit the National Employment Authority website. There's quite some information around there, and a lot of dissemination is going. Of course, it has not really taken in the larger public shape due to, of course, to the limited resources, but there are efforts by different actors to ensure that everyone around the country gets to know about trafficking in persons and how to access various services. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think the follow-up question, and which I said, Juliet, we don't have an animal called the government that is a solution to everything. So Seagate asks, how can the ordinary person stand against trafficking in all its forms locally? And are there forums or a helpline or any other established mechanisms that you can point towards, other than, of course, Love Justice?
Great. Yes. Well, there's Veronica. There's Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. This is where we first report. This is where we first report. And there is nothing that gives me, why I'm really happy that Veronica is the chairperson is because Veronica wears two hats. There is the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. They receive complaints. That is one hat. Then the other hat they wear is the one that they monitor the government's obligations. Those three obligations that I gave, they monitor, is the government doing, this animal called the government, are they doing their job? Then there is obviously the National Employment Authority, and also there is the Directorate of Children's Services, which is the secretary that hosts. So this is where we can report. Let me reiterate and say this. I see this question, in fact, to answer your question, there's another one here. So something is not legitimate in this fight against trafficking. How come women, lobbyists, and civil societies are not coming out to stand against this vice that is perpetrated upon Kenyan girls, even as there is all the hype with evidence and corpses, maimed women in return? What is hidden? Yet the lobbyists and CSOs and international groups are normally very vocal on women issues. What is hidden? It says that why is Kenya not able to embark with the Saudi and other countries where its labor is tortured? What is the value of the Kenyan child life? Or adults, if this is a serious human crime, unless government blah blah blah. You know what? I feel this person's anger, and I feel their fire. But I want to remind us that we as the citizen, we don't have to wait for a civil society. Recently, I was speaking in a church, and I said, we have the greatest church. So why not start from the church? Why not start this conversation from our religious institutions before we say that the government should? So one of the things that we have to remember in terms of balancing, in Kenya, we have the constitution. that, then I would be among the first ones to say, no, you're interfering with our human rights. But what is it that we can do? It is really to enable the public to be able to demand we need to have in every one of us, so that when you hear your cousin, your friend, your brother, your sister, once you travel to the Saudi, you're asking, tell me the recruitment agency that gave you this document. Take me to the recruitment agency. Let's have a conversation with them. Do they know whose house you're going to? Then also, really, we can look, which are the countries that have fair recruitment practices? For instance, what I know of Qatar is that Qatar lifted this rule that is called kafala, the kafala system, which is the one that makes the employer sort of own you in these other countries. But it was a progressive move for Qatar to have this kind of policy within them. And it all came from lobbying within their own country, but also from the sending countries. So it's also a question of demand. So this is why I'd say, for me, I'd ask Veronica and the rest of the people who are now working very closely with the government, is really to create that demand for safe recruitment, for safe migration, and for excellent, what is it called, role from the other countries as well. Thank you.
Indeed. And I think you've already received a volunteer. So somebody's asking, finally, are there volunteering opportunities? Some of us would want to be involved, please. Veronica, I think also in the government you take interns. So here is it.
Yes, Emily, please. This is my email. Get in touch with me. And my colleague is here called Glenn, so he can also just take your details, Emily. Thank you.
All right, so last question. You've highlighted many laws, local and international. Do they give a penalty to the infringing country, or costs are borne by Kenya, the mother country, to the women receiving the corpse or maimed? Yes, stand for family and economic rights locally, which is a stand over corruption locally first. So there are opportunities even locally. I think he's asking, now that the Counter-Trafficking Act, I think, and all the penalties that you've been able to highlight, when we talk about the other countries, like what we're calling the GCC countries, and get me to tell people what is GCC countries. Some people don't know. So when they're also on that end, is there any penalties that also accrue to them as well?
Veronica, do you want to respond?
Allow me to go in that. So thank you. I'm liking that about the penalties. Number one, most of the times you realize our Kenyan girls and young men, when they leave the country, when they live here and they go out there, they go for work, they sign contracts which are, one, based in Kenya, applying Kenyan laws. But unfortunately, what has really been brought to light is that at the point of their arrival in the other country, they also sign other contracts which are in different language, and of course, which in one way or the other sort of take away the legality or the application of our Kenyan laws into that particular perspective. And this is an area where I know the Ministry of Labour is working closely with the different countries, and in particular countries where the government of Kenya has signed what we call the bilateral labor agreements, in order to ensure that we have enforced implementation framework that can have that clarity as to which law should apply, and at what point should a Kenyan who has been violated, whether abroad or internally, come in to seek a redress mechanism. So that is work in progress for now. We do not have a law that specifically says this is it, but if you look at Counter-Trafficking Persons Act, it does provide penalties for any person who is found to have committed the offense of trafficking in person. And of course, the penalties are in millions and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica. And just a quick question from my end. Now that we have all these agencies licensed at NEA, or they are supposed to be licensed at NEA. So if I am Muthoni who intends to go to Qatar or these GCC countries, is it the website, does it also provide a sort of a clarification that these are the registered agencies, or how do I find that information?
Thank you. The NEA has all the details about the different agencies, and also they are open for parents and even the new persons who want to travel abroad to call in and just check with them whether the jobs are genuine, and even to have the due diligence. And on the other side, the NEA, Ministry of Labor and Ministry of Foreign Affairs are working closely to ensure that even for the girls or young men who travel abroad, have their contracts looked at by the Ministry of Labor. But at the point of departure, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is able to at least, the Ministry of Migration is able to really check as to whether they have all the documentation that are needed for them to leave the country. So we have had some cases where some young people have been returned or have been refused to get to the flight because of lacking some of the documentation. So there's good progress there. However, there's a lot that we need to do awareness, but again, also to just reinforce our policies in order to provide more grounded redress mechanism for Kenyans. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica. I think, Juliet, you can take the last question from JW. You can read it out loud.
Actually, I was checking this. Will this international labor docket be under labor or the new diaspora ministry? I'm not sure. Veronica, do you know which whatever is? Because these are all executive order discussions, so I don't know which international labor docket you're talking about. But I don't know if it's something we said. Could you, maybe Jay, you could clarify for us, and maybe we could hear your voice in the process.
I can speak about it.
Okay, Veronica can go ahead.
Yes, I know where the question is coming from. I know the new president, His Excellency Dr. Ruto, did speak to the fact that they are having seen a lot of concerns at the trends of Kenyans who are suffering abroad. There was need for him, and he suggested that he's going to really focus on establishing a diaspora ministry. So we are aware those are nitty-gritties that need to be done with regard to executive orders. But again, it will be a win for Kenyans. And in particular, our desire is to call the Ministry of Migration and Diaspora such that then we don't miss out on the issues of the human people that are going to the Gulf, but rather just ensure that also we have Kenyans who again are working in India, Lebanon, where we have another crisis going on. And oftentimes we have cases of violation. And a good example will be the case of the Kenyans. Remember, we had a whole lot of public pandemic there, and there was a lot of issues of migrant rights violations. So there, that at least we know the ministry will handle that. But currently, issues of diaspora are housed within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have Diaspora and Consulate Services Department. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica. I don't think there's any further question from the chat section, but JW does say that thank you for the talk. Your work is really tough. So he appreciates you, even if funding was an issue at some point, nonetheless. Thank you so much, Juliet, for agreeing to do this with us. Thank you so much, Veronica. I think you mentioned a couple of other colleagues, I think, on the call. Maybe they could say a quick hello before we sign off. I think you mentioned somebody from, I think, the committee.
Yes, there's Mary Mbuga.
Yeah.
Mary, do you want to say hi?
Just a quick hello.
And also there is my Love Justice's program manager, June Derito. If she can also say hi, if she wants.
Hello, I'm Mary. Yes, hello, I'm Mary Mbuga from the Counter-Trafficking Secretariat. And I've enjoyed listening to this forum. It's very informative. And this is one of the ways that we are really recommending that we all talk about trafficking and tell it to everybody, because we are all stakeholders. So I have really appreciated this forum, and I wish we can have many more of this. I think we are sensitizing the right people, the lawyers and the legal people. So it's a good forum. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. June, I can see your camera is on.
Thank you, Ruth. Ruth is our champion at Love Justice, and we truly appreciate her. Yes, I think she said a lot about Love Justice. It's good to be here to hear the stuff that I didn't know Veronica was in the. Now I know. Good to see you again, Veronica. And yeah, so I think for us as Love Justice, we invite members of the public, especially people who may have that access, to transit points. Maybe you are going through the bus station, railways, tea room. If you have any information, share with us so that we can enhance the work that we do there of transit monitoring. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, June. So Veronica has been kind enough to leave her contacts at the chat session. Kindly, if you have any cases or you do know of people who have been trafficked or children, there's a helpline that has been attached to the chat section. I think, Juliet, you also left your contact or email address. If you could just do that one more time for our participants. But a very warm asante to you, Juliet, and to you, Veronica, for taking your time to share with us about human trafficking. And I keep saying, I think a lot of times we want to sensationalize it, but not really get into the legal or what activities the government is actually doing. This so-called animal we keep calling the government is actually working. And I think now people know where are the spaces that we can always, cry for help or report cases where we have witnessed that human trafficking is being undertaken. Udani Njogu is your host, Njogu and Associate Advocate. Thank you so much to all you participants individually, and we hope to see you in the next webinar. And Juliet will definitely have a sequel for this. Really, really a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.